Hey folks, I know I am just an old guy telling stories, but please leave a like and subscribe before we start. Let's enjoy in today's stories. Before I dive into today's stories, I want to say, disclaimer, the content presented in the video is purely for entertainment purposes only. The theories and stories discussed in this video are speculative and are not supported by any evidence or proof. Viewer discretion is advised. The gravel crunched beneath Daniel's boots as he approached the imposing gates of Blackthorn Penitentiary. The prison had been abandoned for over a decade, shrouded in rumors of ghostly apparitions and unexplainable occurrences. To Daniel, however, it was just another job. As a documentary filmmaker, the appeal lay in unraveling the mystery and exposing the truth, even if that truth was grim. Blackthorn's architecture loomed in the twilight like the skeletal remains of a forgotten beast. Rust streaked the iron bars, vines clawed at the crumbling stone walls, and the air reeked of mildew and something far more sinister. The penitentiary had once been infamous for housing the most dangerous criminals, but whispers of inhumane experiments and unexplained disappearances had hastened its closure. Daniel gripped his camera tightly, adjusting the lens as he glanced at his small crew. Each of them wore uneasy expressions, their breath visible in the chilling evening air. "You sure about this?" Clara, his assistant, asked. Her voice trembled slightly, though she tried to mask it with a smirk. "We've done worse," Daniel replied, though he didn't quite believe it himself. "We get in, we document, and we get out. Simple." The gate creaked open with a groan that seemed to echo for miles. Daniel's heart pounded as they stepped inside. The interior was worse than he imagined. The cell blocks stretched endlessly, lined with rusted bars and flickering light bulbs that hadn't seen power in years. A sense of suffocating silence settled over them. It wasn't just the absence of sound, it was the presence of something unnatural. "Why does it feel alive?" Clara whispered, clutching her flashlight. Daniel ignored her, focusing his camera on the graffiti-stained walls. The words scrawled there were cryptic. "They never left. It watches and run while you can." As they ventured deeper, they stumbled upon the infirmary. Rusty beds and shattered glass littered the floor, but it was the drawings that froze them in place. Childlike scribbles covered every inch of the walls. Stick figures, eyes, and unsettling phrases like "keep me safe" and "don't hurt her." "Who'd let a kid in here?" Clara asked, her voice barely a whisper. Daniel shook his head, but before he could answer, a faint noise caught their attention. It was a soft sobbing, distant but unmistakable. The sound twisted Daniel's stomach. They exchanged uneasy glances before he motioned for them to follow. The sobbing led them to cell block D, the heart of the prison, a place even the guards had once feared. As they approached, the air grew colder, and an oppressive weight pressed against their chests. The sobbing abruptly stopped as they reached a particular cell. The door was ajar, and Daniel hesitated before pushing it open. Inside, the cell was devoid of furniture, but the walls were scratched raw, as if someone had clawed at them desperately. Words were etched everywhere. "Where are they?" and "help me." "This can't be real," Clara muttered, backing away. A sudden noise erupted from behind them, a deafening crash. The crew spun around, hearts racing. The corridor they had just walked through was now sealed off by bars that hadn't been there moments before. "What the hell is going on?" Clara yelled, her voice bouncing off the walls. Before Daniel could answer, the sobbing returned, this time much closer. It seemed to emanate from all around them, filling the air with an unbearable sorrow. It was a child's cry, laced with pain and fear. But as Daniel listened, a chilling realization crept over him. The cries weren't asking for help. They were warning him to leave. Yet the path back was gone, and the shadows seemed to move on their own. Daniel tightened his grip on the camera as the air grew colder, the temperature dropping so rapidly that his breath fogged up the lens. Clara's flashlight flickered, casting erratic beams of light across the walls. The scribbled words seemed to move, the jagged lines twisting into grotesque shapes in the shadows. "Daniel, we need to get out of here," Clara said, her voice barely audible over the pounding of her footsteps as she backed toward him. "The bars are blocking the way," Daniel reminded her, his voice steady despite the panic rising in his chest. "We have to find another way out." As they turned to explore the darkened corridor, a low murmur reached their ears. It wasn't the sobbing from before. This was different. A chorus of whispers, barely distinguishable from the creak of the old structure, seemed to be calling their names. "Did you hear that?" Clara whispered, her flashlight trembling in her hands. Daniel nodded, his eyes scanning the darkness ahead. The whispers grew louder as they advanced, forming words that sent chills down his spine. "Stay with us." They came to a fork in the hallway. One path led deeper into the prison, where the air seemed to grow even darker, almost as if it were swallowing the light. The other path led toward the administrative wing, where shattered glass and overturned desks told stories of a hasty evacuation. "Which way?" Clara asked, glancing nervously over her shoulder. Daniel hesitated. The rational part of his mind screamed to head for the administrative wing, but the filmmaker in him couldn't resist the allure of the deeper corridor. He pointed toward the darkness. "Are you serious?" Clara asked, her eyes wide with fear. "There might be answers down there," Daniel said, his voice firm. "And if there are, we're not leaving without them." With reluctance etched across her face, Clara followed. The deeper they went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. The walls seemed to close in, the air thick with the stench of decay. Daniel felt an inexplicable pull, as if the prison itself were drawing him in, whispering secrets that begged to be uncovered. They reached the end of the hallway, where a massive steel door loomed before them. Unlike the rest of the prison, this door was pristine, its surface gleaming under the faint glow of Clara's flashlight. A single word was etched into the metal: "Sanctum." "What is this place?" Clara murmured, her hand brushing against the cold steel. Daniel didn't answer. He reached for the handle, his fingers trembling. As he turned it, the whispers ceased abruptly, replaced by a deafening silence that pressed against his ears. The door creaked open, revealing a cavernous room bathed in a sickly green light. In the center stood a single chair, its leather straps worn and stained. Surrounding it were dozens of cameras, each pointing toward the chair, their lenses cracked but somehow still functional. "This isn't right," Clara said, stepping back. "We shouldn't be here." Daniel raised his camera, capturing the scene despite the gnawing sense of dread. As he focused the lens, a shadow moved across the frame, a figure standing behind the chair. He lowered the camera, his heart skipping a beat, but there was nothing there. "Daniel," Clara whispered, her voice trembling. "Something's watching us." Before he could respond, the door slammed shut behind them, plunging the room into darkness. For a moment, Neither Daniel nor Clara moved, their breathing shallow and ragged in the suffocating darkness. The silence was oppressive, amplifying every heartbeat, every creak of the ancient building around them. Suddenly, a faint hum began to fill the room, a low, vibrating sound that seemed to emanate from the very walls. "Daniel, turn on the camera light," Clara whispered, her voice shaking. Daniel fumbled with the camera, the small LED beam finally piercing the gloom. The greenish light reflected off the strange apparatus in the center of the room. The chair's leather straps seemed to glisten, as if freshly used. Around the room, the cracked lenses of the cameras seemed to follow their every movement. "This is some kind of experiment room," Daniel muttered, stepping closer to the chair. His fingers brushed against the cold metal, and an involuntary shiver ran down his spine. They recorded something here. Clara shone her flashlight on the walls, revealing faint outlines of human figures scratched into the plaster. Each figure was accompanied by a name and a date, some decades old, others impossibly recent. These are people," Clara said, her voice barely audible. "Why would their names be here?" As they examined the walls, the hum grew louder, almost resonating within their skulls. Daniel's camera began to glitch, static filling the screen intermittently. He adjusted the settings, but the image only became worse. Through the static, he saw fleeting glimpses of something, a shadowy figure standing beside Clara. "Clara, don't move," Daniel said, his voice trembling. "What? What is it?" Clara asked, fear evident in her tone. Before Daniel could answer, the shadow darted out of frame, the hum escalating into a deafening roar. The room seemed to vibrate, the air growing thicker with every passing second. Lights from the cameras flickered to life, casting eerie beams that danced across the walls. "We need to leave," Clara yelled, grabbing Daniel's arm. But as they turned toward the door, they froze. The chair in the center of the room was no longer empty. A figure sat there, its form shrouded in darkness. Its head slowly lifted, revealing hollow eyes that seemed to pierce through them. The straps tightened around its limbs on their own, as if the room itself sought to contain it. "You shouldn't have come here," a guttural voice echoed, the sound coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. Daniel felt the camera slip from his grasp as a wave of cold swept over him. The figure began to rise, the straps snapping like brittle twigs. Clara screamed, her flashlight tumbling to the ground, its beam spinning wildly across the room. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Clara and bolting toward the door. But the door didn't budge. It was as if the room had sealed them in, the walls closing in around them. The figure stepped forward, its movements slow but deliberate. With each step, the green light dimmed, the shadows consuming everything in their path. Daniel and Clara pressed themselves against the door, their panic mounting as the figure loomed closer. And then, just as the shadows were about to engulf them, the humming stopped. The room fell silent, the figure vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. The door creaked open, revealing the dark corridor beyond. "What the hell just happened?" Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. Daniel didn't answer. He grabbed his camera, its screen cracked but still functional, and pulled Clara into the hallway. But as they stumbled away from the sanctum, the whispers returned, louder and more insistent than before. "You can't leave." The corridor seemed darker than before, as if the shadows had thickened in their absence. Daniel and Clara moved quickly, their footsteps echoing eerily. The whispers followed, not fading with distance, but growing clearer, more human. "You can't leave," they murmured, 100 voices in unison. "You must listen." "Daniel," Clara said, clutching his arm. "What if they're trying to tell us something?" Daniel stopped, looking at her with wide, fearful eyes. "Clara, whatever's in here isn't on our side. We need to keep moving." But just as they turned the corner, a figure stepped out of the darkness. It was a man, hollow-eyed, pale, and dressed in a tattered prison uniform. His form was translucent, flickering like an old film strip, but his voice was painfully clear. "You shouldn't be here," he said, his tone heavy with despair. "They don't let anyone leave." Clara instinctively stepped back, her flashlight trembling. Daniel raised his camera, focusing on the figure. "Who are you?" he asked, forcing his voice to remain steady. The prisoner tilted his head, his expression one of sorrow. "I was like you once, a curious fool. They fed on it. They'll feed on you too." "What do you mean, they?" Clara demanded, her fear giving way to anger. "Who's doing this?" The man's gaze shifted, as though looking at something over their shoulders. "They don't have names, only hunger. You've seen them, haven't you?" Daniel nodded, his throat dry. "The figure in the chair, the shadows." The prisoner gave a small, sad smile. "They were prisoners like me, like everyone who came here. But the warden, he made deals, promises to things he couldn't understand. Now the prison is theirs." "What does that mean for us?" Clara whispered, barely able to keep her voice steady. The prisoner's flickering form grew more unstable, his voice cracking with urgency. "They'll keep you, break you, until you're one of them. Unless what?" Daniel pressed, stepping closer. "You destroy it. The source," the prisoner said, his voice a strained whisper. "The sanctum is their anchor. But the warden hid the key. You'll have to find it before they—" The prisoner's words were cut off as his form dissolved into a swirling mass of shadows. The corridor erupted in a deafening roar, the whispers turning to screams. Clara grabbed Daniel's arm, pulling him forward. "Run!" she screamed. The wall seemed to come alive, dark tendrils writhing out of the stone, reaching for them. Daniel and Clara sprinted blindly, their path lit only by the dim glow of the flashlight. The prison shifted around them, corridors bending and looping impossibly. "Daniel, we're trapped!" Clara cried. "Not yet!" Daniel yelled, skidding to a stop as they reached a rusted staircase. "Upstairs, maybe we can find a way out." They climbed, the steps groaning under their weight. The shadows clawed at their heels, an ever-present reminder of the danger closing in. At the top of the stairs, they burst into a small office. Papers and broken furniture littered the floor, and a single window offered a glimpse of the night sky. Clara collapsed against the wall, her breath ragged. What do we do now?" Daniel scanned the room, his eyes landing on an old metal safe, partially hidden under a desk. If the warden hid something, it might be in there. He dropped to his knees, tugging at the safe's rusted handle. It wouldn't budge. Clara joined him, her trembling hands pulling at the lock. "We need a key or a combination." A sudden crash made them both freeze. The shadows had reached the room, seeping under the door like a living tide. The whispers returned, more sinister than ever. "You can't escape." Daniel's camera flickered to life on its own, the screen showing static before a number appeared, 132409. "The combination!" Clara gasped. Daniel spun the dial, his hands shaking as he input the numbers. The safe creaked open, revealing an ornate metal key and a yellowed piece of paper. The note read, "The sanctum must be sealed. Do not fail." Before they could process the words, the door burst open, the shadows pouring in. "Go!" Daniel shouted, grabbing the key and dragging Clara toward the window. They climbed onto the ledge, the freezing night air biting at their skin. Below, the courtyard stretched out like a gaping maw. Clara looked down, her fear warring with her desperation. "We'll never survive the fall." Daniel glanced behind them. The shadows were closing in, their forms twisting into grotesque shapes. "It's better than what's coming." With that, he leapt, pulling Clara with him into the darkness. The wind roared around them. As Daniel and Clara fell, their screams lost in the howling night. The ground rushed up to meet them, but instead of the crushing impact they braced for, they landed in something soft and cold. Daniel gasped as he realized they were in a pit of ash. The fine, powdery substance clung to their clothes and skin, the air thick with its acrid scent. Clara coughed violently, struggling to her feet. What is this?" she stammered, wiping ash from her face. Daniel's eyes adjusted to the dim light, revealing their surroundings. They were in a massive courtyard, enclosed by towering walls of the prison. But the courtyard wasn't empty. Scattered across the ground were the remnants of old furniture, rusted tools, and skeletal remains, all half buried in the ash. "We're still in the prison," Daniel muttered, his voice hollow. "We didn't escape." A low rumble echoed through the courtyard, making the ground vibrate. Clara clutched Daniel's arm. "We need to keep moving," she said, her voice trembling. "That thing could still be following us." Daniel nodded, his grip tightening around the key. "We have to find the sanctum's core. Whatever that note meant, this key is our only chance." They moved cautiously, weaving through the debris. The shadows seemed alive, shifting and writhing at the edges of their vision. Clara's flashlight flickered, its beam weak and unreliable. Every sound, the crunch of ash underfoot, the distant creak of metal, set their nerves on edge. As they reached the far end of the courtyard, they found a rusted grate set into the ground. It was partially open, revealing a narrow tunnel that descended into darkness. A faint, otherworldly glow emanated from within. "Do you think this leads to the sanctum?" Clara asked, peering into the tunnel. Daniel hesitated. "It's possible. But if we go down there, there's no turning back." Clara met his gaze, her expression resolute, despite the fear in her eyes. "We don't have a choice." They climbed into the tunnel, the metal walls damp and claustrophobic. The air grew colder with every step, the faint glow illuminating twisted roots that snaked along the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, their voices echoing in the confined space. "Closer," they urged. "Closer!" The tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient machinery. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, pulsating with a sickly green light. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly. Surrounding the altar were more cameras, their lenses cracked and caked with dust, all pointed at the stone. Daniel and Clara approached cautiously. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural energy that made their skin crawl. "This has to be it," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up the key, its metal gleaming in the eerie light. The core of the sanctum. Before Clara could respond, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The shadows coalesced at the edges of the room, forming into grotesque, shifting shapes. Eyes glowed in the darkness, filled with malice and hunger. "They know we're here," Clara said, backing toward the altar. Daniel tightened his grip on the key. "Then we end this. Now, do you think this leads to the sanctum?" Clara asked, peering into the tunnel. Daniel hesitated. "It's possible. But if we go down there, there's no turning back." Clara met his gaze, her expression resolute, despite the fear in her eyes. "We don't have a choice." They climbed into the tunnel, the metal walls damp and claustrophobic. The air grew colder with every step, the faint glow illuminating twisted roots that snaked along the walls. The whispers returned, louder and more distinct, their voices echoing in the confined space. "Closer," they urged. "Closer!" The tunnel opened into a cavernous chamber, its walls lined with ancient machinery. At the center of the room stood a massive stone altar, pulsating with a sickly green light. Strange symbols were etched into its surface, glowing faintly. Surrounding the altar were more cameras, their lenses cracked and caked with dust, all pointed at the stone. Daniel and Clara approached cautiously. The air was heavy, thick with an unnatural energy that made their skin crawl. "This has to be it," Daniel said, his voice barely above a whisper. He held up the key, its metal gleaming in the eerie light. The core of the sanctum. Before Clara could respond, a deep, guttural growl echoed through the chamber. The shadows coalesced at the edges of the room, forming into grotesque, shifting shapes. Eyes glowed in the darkness, filled with malice and hunger. "They know we're here," Clara said, backing toward the altar. Daniel tightened his grip on the key. "Then we end this. Now." The moment Daniel twisted the key fully into the altar, the glowing symbols erupted with blinding light, momentarily illuminating the entire chamber. Clara shielded her eyes, the piercing brightness cutting through the dense shadows. For a fleeting moment, the room felt still, almost serene, until the screaming began again, louder than ever. The altar split open, revealing a hidden compartment. Inside was an object unlike anything they had ever seen. A pulsating orb, black as night, streaked with veins of vivid green light. It seemed alive, its rhythm syncing with Daniel's racing heartbeat. "What the hell is that?" Clara asked, her voice trembling as she backed away. Daniel reached for the orb, his fingers hesitant but compelled. The instant his skin touched its surface, a wave of visions flooded his mind. He saw the prison in its prime, guards patrolling the halls, prisoners locked in cells, and the warden standing before the sanctum. But the warden was not alone. Figures cloaked in shadow surrounded him, their forms twisting unnaturally. Daniel heard their voices, a cacophony of promises and threats. Power, control, immortality. The warden had made a pact, sealing the prison's fate, and now his. Daniel staggered back, dropping the orb onto the altar. The warden, he didn't just trap the prisoners here, he trapped them. These shadows, these things, they're bound to this place because of him. Clara stared at the orb, her expression a mix of fear and determination. If that's their anchor, we destroy it. We end this. Before Daniel could respond, the shadows surged forward, their shapes shifting into grotesque forms. Faces emerged within the darkness, anguished, tormented souls screaming silently as they clawed toward the altar. The orb's glow intensified, drawing them in like moths to a flame. "They're protecting it!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Clara's arm and pulling her away from the encroaching darkness. "They won't let us destroy it without a fight." Clara's flashlight flickered and died, leaving only the sickly green light of the orb to illuminate the chamber. The shadows closed in, their forms towering and monstrous. Daniel grabbed a rusted pipe from the debris on the floor, swinging it at the nearest figure. The weapon passed through the shadow harmlessly, but the creature recoiled, as if in pain. "They're vulnerable near the orb," Daniel realized. "It's their anchor, but it's also their weakness." Clara nodded, her fear giving way to resolve. She snatched a heavy metal shard from the ground and swung it wildly, forcing the shadows back. "Then let's make this count!" Daniel climbed onto the altar, the orb pulsating beneath him. He raised the pipe high, ready to smash it down, but the shadows lashed out, their tendrils wrapping around his arms and legs. He cried out, the cold seeping into his skin like ice. "Daniel!" Clara screamed, charging forward. She struck at the shadows, her makeshift weapon dispersing them momentarily. "Do it now!" With a surge of strength, Daniel brought the pipe down on the orb. The impact sent a shock wave through the chamber, the light exploding outward. The shadows shrieked, their forms dissolving into nothingness as the orb cracked and splintered. The ground beneath the altar began to quake violently, and the machinery lining the walls sparked and groaned. "We need to get out of here!" Clara yelled, grabbing Daniel's hand and pulling him off the altar. The chamber was collapsing, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the light from the orb dimmed and died. They sprinted back toward the tunnel, the walls trembling around them. The whispers were gone, replaced by a deafening silence that was almost worse. As they emerged into the courtyard, the prison seemed to groan, its very structure unraveling. Daniel looked back at the crumbling sanctum, his chest heaving. "It's over," he said, his voice raw. "They're gone." But as Clara turned to him, her face pale and her eyes wide, Daniel felt a cold chill run down his spine. "Daniel," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "The gates still closed." Daniel froze, the weight of Clara's words sinking in. The gate, their only exit, loomed in the distance, still sealed tight. Around them, the air crackled with tension, as if the prison itself resisted their escape. Maybe it just needs time," Daniel stammered, though he knew better. His heart pounded as he turned back toward the collapsing sanctum. "We destroyed the orb. That should have ended this." Clara stepped closer, her voice trembling. "What if destroying the orb wasn't enough? What if the warden left something behind? A failsafe?" As if in response to her words, a low, guttural laugh echoed through the courtyard. Daniel and Clara spun around, their eyes scanning the shadows. From the darkness emerged a figure, its form hazy and insubstantial, but unmistakably human. The warden. "You think it's over?" The apparition sneered, its voice dripping with malice. "You've only severed one chain. This place still answers to me." Daniel gritted his teeth, gripping the pipe in his hands. "You're dead. You don't have control anymore." The warden's form flickered, stepping closer. "Dead?" he mocked. "Perhaps, but death here is not an escape. I am bound to this prison as surely as you are now." Clara's voice was barely a whisper. "What do you want?" The warden tilted his head, his hollow eyes boring into them. "To ensure no one leaves. My pact demanded sacrifices, and this prison demands souls. You've given it plenty, but it's not satisfied." Daniel stepped forward, his anger overriding his fear. "We destroyed the orb. We freed the spirits you trapped." The warden chuckled, a sound that sent chills down their spines. "The orb was a tool, nothing more. The heart of the prison remains, hidden deep where even you won't dare to tread." Clara grabbed Daniel's arm, her voice urgent. "We can't listen to him. He's trying to trap us." The ground beneath them began to tremble, cracks spiderwebbing across the courtyard as the prison groaned in protest. The warden's form started to dissipate, his voice echoing as he faded. "If you want to leave, find the heart, or die here with the rest." The earth gave a violent lurch, and a massive chasm split the courtyard. Daniel and Clara barely managed to leap to safety, landing in a heap on the other side. Below them, the chasm glowed with a sickly green light, the same hue as the orb. "We don't have a choice," Daniel said, pulling Clara to her feet. "We have to go down there." Clara's face was pale, but she nodded. "If it's the only way." Together they approached the edge of the chasm. The air was thick with the stench of decay and something far worse, something ancient and malevolent. Without another word, they began their descent into the abyss. "If you're tied to the heart," Daniel growled, his voice trembling but steady, "then destroying it ends this nightmare. For good." The towering monstrosity tilted its head, its ever-shifting form bristling with malice. "You think you can destroy me?" it hissed, its guttural voice reverberating through the cavern. "I am this place. I am the prison. You will never leave." Clara stepped closer to Daniel, her eyes locked on the pulsating structure at the center of the cavern. "Daniel, if the heart is alive, it has to have a weakness. We just need to find it." The creature roared, its elongated limbs lashing out toward them. Daniel barely managed to shove Clara aside as a massive tendril slammed into the ground where they'd stood. The vibrations nearly knocked them off their feet. "Go for the chains," Daniel yelled, pointing toward the glowing bindings that stretched from the walls to the heart. "If we break them, it might weaken it." Clara nodded, grabbing a sharp piece of debris from the ground. She sprinted toward one of the chains, dodging another swipe from the creature. Daniel swung his rusted pipe at the closest tendril, keeping the monster's attention on him. The chain was thick and covered in rust, but Clara struck it with all her strength. Sparks flew as the shard bit into the metal, the glow dimming slightly with each strike. The creature howled, its form flickering as it turned its focus on her. "No, you don't!" Daniel shouted, charging at the monster. He swung his pipe at one of its legs, the impact causing the creature to stumble. "Over here, you freak!" The distraction worked. Clara gave the chain one final strike, and it snapped with a deafening crack. The cavern shook, the heart pulsating erratically as the remaining chains strained to hold it in place. "Keep going," Daniel yelled, dodging another swipe from the creature. Clara ran to the next chain, her movements frantic but determined. The creature's rage was palpable, its form shifting violently as it lashed out in all directions. A tendril caught Daniel in the side, sending him crashing into the cavern wall. He groaned in pain, but forced himself to stand, clutching the pipe like a lifeline. "Daniel!" Clara screamed, pausing mid-strike. "I'm fine," he lied, blood trickling from his temple. "Just keep going." Clara turned back to the chain, her strikes echoing through the cavern. With each blow, the heart's light flickered, its rhythm faltering. The creature grew more unstable, its limbs dissolving and reforming as it struggled to maintain its shape. Finally, with a final, desperate swing, Clara severed the second chain. The cavern shook violently, the ground cracking beneath their feet. The heart throbbed wildly, its glow pulsating like a dying star. "Two down, two to go," Daniel shouted, running toward another chain. Clara followed, the air growing colder and heavier with each passing second. The creature's form began to collapse, its roar turning into a guttural wail. "You cannot end this," it bellowed. This place will never let you go. Daniel and Clara worked together, striking the third chain until it snapped. The heart's glow dimmed further, the cavern trembling as the structure sagged under its own weight. "One more!" Clara yelled, her voice barely audible over the cacophony. As they approached the final chain, the creature unleashed a deafening roar, its remaining limbs flailing wildly. A tendril struck Clara, knocking her to the ground. Daniel rushed to her side, helping her to her feet. "I've got you," he said, his voice firm despite his exhaustion. Together they attacked the final chain, their strikes synchronized and relentless. The creature's form flickered violently, its howls fading into a desperate whimper. With one final swing, the last chain shattered. The heart collapsed in on itself, the glowing veins along the walls fading into darkness. The creature let out a final, anguished scream before dissolving into nothingness. The cavern began to crumble, chunks of stone falling from the ceiling as the ground heaved beneath them. "Run!" Daniel shouted, grabbing Clara's hand. They sprinted toward the chasm they had descended, the walls collapsing around them. The green light was gone, replaced by total darkness. As they climbed out of the chasm, the prison above groaned, its very foundation crumbling. They reached the courtyard just as the walls began to collapse inward. The gate, once sealed tight, now stood wide open, bathed in the light of the rising sun. "We did it!" Clara gasped, tears streaming down her face. "We're free." Daniel nodded, his chest heaving as he stared at the open gate. "Let's not stick around to see what's left." Together, they stumbled through the gate and into the open air, the prison collapsing behind them in a deafening roar. As they reached the safety of the nearby woods, they turned back one last time. Blackthorn Penitentiary was gone, reduced to rubble. The shadows, the whispers, the warden, they were all gone. But as Daniel and Clara walked away, the faint sound of a distant, guttural laugh echoed through the air, sending a chill down their spines.